I remember the day it surfaced, that notebook. A tattered, spiral-bound relic buried under decades of red tape dust, filed in a box labeled Miscellaneous Student Material, 1980s. Most documents in that category never saw the light of day. But a junior archivist, fresh out of graduate school and hungry to impress, opened the wrong box at the perfect time. It was late October. The Library of Congress was unusually quiet, a seasonal lull between research cycles. The archivist, Lena Moss, had been tasked with cataloging overlooked records in the lower-level vault. That's where she found it. A slim blue notebook, its cover faded, corners curled like old leaves. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd find at a thrift store and toss in a pile of forgotten school supplies, but inside, things were different. The handwriting was smooth, elegant, consistent. Notes were dated between 1980 and 1982, and the content, well, that's what changed everything. These weren't class notes. They were dense, layered reflections on American power structures, international conflict, and race relations. There were full-page diagrams outlining potential legislative reforms. Concept bills, many of which didn't exist until decades later. Healthcare models. Police oversight frameworks. Even passages on drone warfare, and then there were the symbols, pages upon pages where text dissolved into spirals of shorthand and ciphered language, not standard cryptography, but something else. Mathematical notations, circled names, arrows, predictions. A passage marked 2020 divide becomes identity. Another, the center will not hold. Not without a voice shaped like contrast. And most chillingly, in clean cursive on the inside back cover, the world will split in two, not by ideology, but by the stories it believes. Lena knew she had something. She submitted the find to her supervisor, who laughed at first until he recognized the initials in the upper right corner of every other page, B.O. And next to them, a dorm address. Columbia University. Class of '83. The comparisons began quietly. A scanned copy of the notebook landed on the desk of a former professor who had corresponded with Barack Obama during his undergrad years. Without prompting, the professor muttered, "The handwriting, that's his." But that wasn't enough. The press got wind of it, and the whole thing broke open in waves. Secret notebook predicted Obama-era policies decades before his presidency. Did Obama see the future? Mysterious Columbia notebook sparks speculation. Journalists descended on Columbia's archives. Analysts combed through the handwriting. AI linguists were brought in to analyze tone and syntax. The verdict? The writing style matched Obama's known essays with over 92% consistency. Not definitive, but enough to make people wonder. The political implications were massive. This wasn't some manifesto by a future radical. It was thoughtful. Precise. Too precise. One passage, for instance, described a healthcare rollout where state exchanges will manage the bulk of citizen applications, but the resistance will center around the word mandate. That's the kind of foresight that doesn't just raise eyebrows, it shakes institutions. Naturally, questions poured in. Was this a hoax? A planted artifact? An AI-generated fake? But the paper, the ink, the binding all matched early 1980s stock, verified by forensic document experts. The metadata on the scanned version hadn't been altered. The notebook had been stored in a sealed box untouched since 1996, based on inventory logs, and then, of course, came the biggest question of all: was this really Barack Obama's notebook? He was asked directly during a quiet moment at a forum on civic engagement. A young reporter from Des Moines, too green to know the rules, stood up and asked, "Mr. President, is the cipher notebook yours?" Obama smiled, that patient, distant smile he always wore when thinking 5 layers ahead, and said only this: "Sometimes, the most important decisions are made before the leader himself is born." That was it. No denial. No confirmation. The media spun it for weeks. Some claimed he meant destiny. Others insisted it was deflection. A few claimed he was alluding to something bigger, a force shaping history through individuals. One conspiracy site even declared, Obama was briefed by time travelers. But while the world debated, a quieter investigation unfolded behind the scenes, one I got pulled into by accident, because someone had to ask the obvious: if that notebook really was his, how did a 20-year-old student in 1982 predict the next 40 years of global conflict with such eerie accuracy? That's what I set out to uncover, and what I found changed everything I thought I knew, not just about Obama, but about the nature of foresight, power, and who really writes the future. I flew to New York 2 weeks after the notebook story broke. Not because I wanted to chase a conspiracy, but because something about it didn't sit right. Too many people were treating it like a novelty. A clever coincidence. A fluke of youthful brilliance. But I couldn't let go of one question: if it really was Barack Obama's notebook, who was he writing for? Columbia University, where he transferred in the early 80s, was strangely cooperative. I expected stone walls, polite rejections, vague statements about protecting privacy. Instead, I was directed to a windowless archive room in Butler Library. The clerk handed me a thin folder without a word. Just a nod, like I wasn't the first person asking. Inside were 6 letters, personal correspondence from Barack Obama to various professors and acquaintances between 1981 and 1983. Most had never been published. Some were barely legible, yellowed from years in storage. But what mattered wasn't what they said, it was how they sounded. His voice was already there. Not just polished. Measured. Observant. Philosophical in a way most students aren't. He wrote about structural inequality like someone who'd lived through 3 administrations, not just one. One letter opened with a quote from Baldwin, followed by a note: "We cannot argue with architecture unless we understand the blueprint. The question is who wrote it." Another referenced a book that wouldn't be published until 1986. Beloved, by Toni Morrison. At first, I thought it was a mistake until I saw the exact phrasing. Her next book, I suspect, will not describe black trauma. It will embody it. Watch the language, it will float, like morning disguised as memory. He'd never met Morrison at that point. The book didn't exist. But the tone, the prediction, it was right. Too right that I sent a scanned copy to a literary professor I knew at Yale. She replied in less than an hour: "That's the voice of someone operating outside time. Or someone pretending to." And then there was the third letter, the one with the code. It was addressed to SP, no last name. No return address. But the envelope was postmarked 1982, Harlem. Inside was a single paragraph, handwritten in careful print, and at the bottom, a small grid. Letters and numbers. 5 rows, 5 columns. The paragraph read: "You asked why I don't share these theories aloud. Because language is only safe until someone understands it. These models are not predictions. They're warnings. And if I'm wrong, it won't matter. But if I'm right, it will be too late to say I told you so." I stared at the grid for hours. It looked like a basic cipher, polyalphabetic or keyword-based. Something school-level. But when I ran it through standard decryption methods, I got nothing coherent. Just fragments, split. 11. Accord. Shallow sky. That I wasn't alone in this. Online forums had exploded with amateur codebreakers dissecting the notebook. Some were obvious cranks. But others were serious minds, ex-military, cryptographers, math prodigies. A few claimed the cipher used a temporal offset encoding based on a future lexicon, like the key didn't exist yet. One user wrote, "The message will make sense only when the moment arrives." Cryptic? Yes. But then again, so was everything in that notebook. Meanwhile, Obama said nothing more. No follow-ups. No clarifications. Just that one haunting line repeated across every outlet: sometimes, the most important decisions are made before the leader is born. He was letting the mystery breathe. Or letting it grow. I spent 3 days at Columbia and walked away with more questions than answers, but back in D.C., something new surfaced. A woman named Nadira Walton, a retired assistant librarian, reached out to me through a mutual contact. She didn't trust the press anymore, she said. Too many agendas. Too much spin. But she trusted whispers. And she had one for me. When we met at a cafe on the corner of 14th and U, she brought a canvas tote bag in a kind of nervous grace. She didn't waste time. I worked at the Library of Congress from 79 to 91. I helped process that box. I blinked. The one with the notebook. She nodded. But that wasn't the only thing in there. She pulled a manila envelope from the bag and slid it across the table. Inside was a photocopy, faded, grainy, of what looked like a memo. Headed with a Library of Congress inventory tag, dated August 1987. The subject, Special Collection, Restricted Predictive Notes, author unconfirmed. There was a line at the bottom, handwritten in pencil, Verify origin. Correlate with subject O files if clearance is expanded. Subject O, I repeated aloud. Nadira just looked at me, and then she said something I still hear in my head every time I read those notebook pages. You think he was writing alone. But what if he was writing back? That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a notebook. It was part of a conversation. A message preserved, maybe planted, for someone in the future. Maybe even, for Obama himself, because the deeper I went, the clearer it became. The cipher wasn't just in the notebook, the cipher was the notebook. And someone, somewhere, had known we'd be reading it now. You'd think by now I'd have reached the limits of strange. A prophetic notebook. A retired librarian hinting at secret files labeled Subject O. Even a cipher that wouldn't unlock because the key supposedly didn't exist yet. But the story kept unfolding, not like a news cycle, but like a riddle. And then I met the man on the steps. It was late a Wednesday in November, just after 10 p.m. I'd spent the day deep in the National Archives, chasing down staff logs from 1987. I was looking for anything referencing the restricted predictive notes. I came up DRY-SO. I did what I always do when I'm stuck. I walked. There's something about DC at night. The monuments glow like they're remembering something, even if we've forgotten what. I ended up at the Lincoln Memorial, half by habit, half by instinct. The place was almost empty. Just the hush of tourists who didn't want to sleep yet and the occasional security sweep, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting alone on the steps, third row from the top. Gray wool coat. Corduroy pants. Thick-rimmed glasses. A notebook in his lap. He wasn't reading. He was waiting. At first, I paid him no mind. But as I passed, he looked up and said, without preamble, "You're not looking for an answer. You're looking for proof that the answer matters." I stopped. He smiled like he'd just offered me coffee. I didn't say a word. I just sat down, 2 steps below him. For a minute, we stared out at the reflecting pool. The Washington Monument cut the sky like a needle sewing history into the night. Then he spoke again. "You know what scares people most about that notebook?" he asked. "It's not the predictions. It's that they weren't meant to be read, not by us, at least." I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He opened his own notebook, leather-bound, old. He didn't show me the pages, but I saw enough to notice something: grids. Symbols. Markings like the ones in the Obama cipher. "The library didn't just misfile it," he said. "They misplaced the others on purpose. Because the rest weren't predictions. They were conversations." I blinked. "Others?" He nodded. "That blue notebook wasn't the only one. It was just the first one they let surface. The others, they're buried. Hidden in donor boxes. Misclassified. But they exist. Notes written by people who never ran for office, never made the news. But they saw things. Patterns. Echoes." He looked at me with a quiet intensity. Obama wasn't predicting the future. He was reacting to something he'd already seen. Something passed down, layer by layer, like code. I should have dismissed him. Chalked it up to late-night conspiracy. But I didn't, because he reached into his coat and handed me a photocopy, 1 page. It wasn't from the blue notebook. The handwriting was different. Older. Less polished. But the words, "The system will rewire itself around perceived stability." The illusion of fairness will become the new frontier of control. If left unchecked, democracy will calcify into spectacle participation without influence. Unless someone rewrites the story. At the bottom, JD, 1968, who's JD? I asked. The man smiled faintly. James Dunham. Sociology student. Georgetown. Died in a car crash. Or so the record says. And you think this is connected to Obama? He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, what do you know about Project ORPHUS? I stared at him. I'd never heard the name before. He took that as confirmation. You won't find it in public archives. It wasn't military. It wasn't academic. It was somewhere in between a research effort in the late 70s and early 80s. Funded through third-tier grants, run by a quiet division at the Library of Congress. Their aim? To track emerging thinkers who demonstrated an unusual capacity for predictive synthesis. Predictive what? He finally turned the notebook toward me. On the open page was a single line, underlined twice, not those who forecast events, but those who sense the structure beneath events. Orpheus, he said, wasn't about knowing the future. It was about identifying the ones who could see how the future gets made through language, belief, timing. They didn't want psychics. They wanted architects. I was quiet for a long time, then I asked, so you're saying Obama was part of that? He shook his head. No. I'm saying Obama may have been the first one to answer back. And that notebook, it wasn't an act of hubris. It was a message. A warning. Maybe even a relay. I asked who else was involved in ORPHUS. He rattled off names. Most I didn't recognize. A few I did: writers, professors, one former ambassador. People who had passed through the edges of power, never quite center stage. But then he said one name that stopped me cold: Samira Ellison. I knew that name. Everyone in D.C. knew it. She was the National Security Advisor for 2 years during the Obama administration. Then, without explanation, she vanished from public life. No scandal. No resignation. Just gone. Rumors had swirled: illness, fallout, classified tension. But no one ever confirmed why she disappeared. The man on the steps closed his notebook. She decoded the first layer of the cipher before she left. Found something buried in the language. A pattern of dates and names. But she never said what it meant. Only that it wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. He stood, dusted off his coat, and walked down the steps that I called after him. Who are you? He paused. Someone who used to archive the wrong kind of stories. And just like that, he was gone. That I went home that night with a copy of the Dunham page. I scanned it under UV light. No watermark. No hidden ink, but in the margin, written so faintly I almost missed it, was one more phrase: he didn't predict the divide. He remembered it. And that was when I knew, the cipher wasn't about seeing what comes next. That it was about recovering what we've already forgotten. That in the end, it was a quote that unraveled the last thread, not a new discovery, not some redacted file smuggled from a vault. Just a line quietly spoken by Barack Obama himself at a private event in Chicago. No cameras. No press. Just a room full of students, a few professors, and a microphone that someone forgot to turn off during cleanup. I didn't hear it firsthand. It was passed to me. A scratchy audio file. 36 seconds. In it, Obama was answering a student's question about leadership, about how a person knows they're ready to carry the weight of history. And in the middle of it, he paused. Then said this: "You're never ready." Not really. But sometimes, the road bends toward you. And all you can do, is remember which parts already happened. That line. It echoed something I'd heard before. I went back to the cipher. To the scanned pages. I reread every passage that felt out of place. And that's when I noticed it, not just in the words, but in the pattern. There were phrases that looped. Ideas repeated across different years, different pages, but with altered tone like echoes evolving with each pass. Point 1 page, dated 1981. A leader must walk the line between belief and burden. Another, undated but marked later in the notebook. When burden becomes belief, you stop serving the future and start replaying the past. The more I read, the more it felt like a memory loop. Not a forecast. A recollection of events not yet lived, but somehow already known. So I called the only person who might understand. Nadira Walton. The retired librarian who'd hinted at Subject O and the missing pieces. She didn't answer right away, but the next morning, there was a note slid under my hotel door. No envelope. Just a single sentence, handwritten in dark blue ink. Meet me where the first draft was burned. I knew where to go. Founders Hall, Subbasement 2. An old archive site in D.C. long since decommissioned. It was once used to store preliminary legislation drafts that never made it past committee. Most were shredded. A few were burned, including the original version of a bill Obama once championed, which was gutted and rewritten entirely before it saw daylight. That I arrived just after dusk. The stairs down were still intact, though barely lit. The air smelled like paper and old paint. Nadira was waiting. She didn't look surprised to see me. No pleasantries. Just this: you're asking the wrong question. I opened my mouth to speak, but she held up a finger. You want to know if Obama saw the future? That's not the story. The story is, who taught him how to remember it? I stared at her. She continued, we call it foresight. But what if it's recursion? What if some minds aren't linear? What if, once in a generation, someone emerges whose memory isn't limited to the past, someone whose mind loops forward, fragments, then returns with shadows of what hasn't happened yet? I said nothing. I couldn't. Nadira pulled out a worn folder from her satchel. Inside were 5 sheets of paper. All copies. All dated before 1980. But the content, I couldn't believe it. Point 1 outlined a strategy for diplomatic engagement with Iran that matched the exact language used during Obama's 2015 agreement. Another described a Supreme Court challenge involving healthcare access, worded with phrasing that wouldn't appear in public debate until 2011. But the most chilling page was simply titled Red Horizon Projection, 2027-2032. It wasn't a prediction. It was a script that IT described civil unrest sparked by digital censorship, rising state-level secession rhetoric, and a moment referred to only as the reversal. A single sentence at the bottom read, if the story cannot be reshaped, it will replay itself with new actors but the same ending. I looked up at her. Where did you get this? She just shook her head. They weren't classified. They were buried. Hidden in plain sight. Because they weren't plans. They were reflections. Memory artifacts from minds that didn't fit the timeline. I asked the only question left to ask, so, was Obama one of them? She paused. For the first time, her composure cracked. He didn't start it. But he was the first to write back. The cipher was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be read by the next one. Whoever came after. Someone who'd understand the weight of memory that doesn't belong to you. I swallowed. My voice barely worked. And do you know what's in the final pages? The one still sealed. Nadira looked at me. Her eyes were tired, but clear. No. But I know this: he never wanted them opened while he was still alive. Some stories only make sense when the final chapter has already happened. She turned to leave, her footsteps soft on the concrete. Just before she reached the stairwell, she said one last thing: be careful where you point that story. Because some mirrors don't reflect, they repeat. I never saw her again, and the notebook, the original, has since been removed from public archives. No official notice. No statement. Just, gone, but I still have the scans. I still have the notes. And sometimes, late at night, I read one line out loud, the one that haunts me most: the world splits in two not by force, but by belief. Whoever controls the story, controls the fracture. I don't know who will find this next, maybe someone younger. Maybe someone smarter, but if you're reading this now, just know the cipher wasn't a message from the past, that IT was a key to the future we're already living, and it's up to you to decide how the next page is written.